Welcome back to our channel. Today we will be exploring the geopolitical situation of the Arctic. The Arctic is Earth's northernmost region, roughly the area north of the Arctic Circle, 66.5 degree north latitude. This zone includes the Arctic Ocean and the lands ringing it, parts of Russia and Scandinavia, all of Canada's northern territories, Greenland and Alaska. The Arctic is mostly ocean, but much of that ocean is cloaked in sea ice year-round. It also harbors large glaciers and ice sheets. In fact, about 20% of the world's fresh water is locked in Arctic glaciers and icebergs, a staggering reservoir. For centuries, the Arctic was locked in ice, home to polar bears, walruses, and tightly knit indigenous communities. Now, due to climate change, the far north is warming about 4 times faster than the global average. Over the past 4 decades, Arctic sea ice has declined by nearly 50%, and scientists predict that we might experience ice-free summers in the Arctic Ocean by early as 2040. As the ice retreats, what was once an isolated polar wasteland is being drawn into global geopolitics. Rapid warming is melting sea ice, opening new shipping lanes, and exposing oil, gas, and mineral deposits once locked under ice. For example, sea routes like the Northern Sea Route (NSR) along Russia's coast and Canada's Northwest Passage (NWP) are now navigable in summer months. These shorter Arctic routes dramatically cut travel time. The journey from Europe to Asia via the NSR is almost half the distance of the Suez Canal route. One report notes that in recent years, the NSR was open for a record 88 days in 2020, up from 69 days in 2012. Shipping traffic is already surging. Between 2013 and 2023, the number of ships in Arctic waters grew 37%, and the distance they sailed increased 111%. In this video, we'll chart the Northern Sea Route and Northwest Passage, the new shipping lanes made possible by melting ice, and the vast untapped resources they uncover. We'll follow the strategic moves of major players, Russia, the US, China, Canada, and Nordic states as they compete for control. We'll also spotlight military and security concerns, as well as environmental risks and the impact on indigenous people. Finally, we'll ask, will the future of the Arctic be defined by cooperation or conflict? One of the biggest game changers is the opening of new shipping routes. For centuries, explorers dreamed of an ice-free passage linking the Atlantic and Pacific. Two main routes exist or are emerging along the Arctic fringe. Northwest Passage (NWP). This string of sea channels weaves through the Canadian Arctic archipelago, connecting the Atlantic via the Labrador Sea to the Pacific via the Bering Strait. It's roughly 7,000 kilometers from Europe to Asia via NWP, about 3,700 nautical miles shorter than the traditional route through Panama or around South America. Northern Sea Route (NSR). This runs along Russia's Arctic coast from the Kara Sea near Norway all the way to the Bering Strait. From St. Petersburg in Europe to Tokyo in Asia, it's about 5,600 kilometers, about half the distance of the Suez Canal route. Russia boasts that the NSR halves the trip to Japan to about 18 days versus 37 days via Suez Canal. The reality today is that each voyage through these Arctic seas requires ice-strengthened ships, often nuclear-powered icebreakers, and careful timing in late summer. Even so, several commercial voyages have begun. Shippers envision connecting Europe and Asia far faster. A container ship using the NSR could shave 10 to 12 days of a China-Europe run compared to Suez. Cruise lines and tourists are also eyeing Arctic cruises. Yet maritime experts caution that even as summer ice vanishes, challenges remain. Severe weather, fog, and narrow straits can still trap vessels. The depths of some passages, especially in the eastern Northwest Passage, may be too shallow for larger ships. Search and rescue and navigational aids in the region are sparse. Governments and companies are racing to build infrastructure, navigational buoys, mapping of the seafloor, satellite tracking, and even ice breaking support. The competition for control of these routes is intensifying. Who owns the northern highways would determine which nation dominates Arctic shipping with huge economic and strategic consequences. Beneath the melting ice caps lie tremendous natural riches. The Arctic is estimated to hold a massive share of the world's undiscovered resources. According to the US Geological Survey, nearly 90 billion barrels of oil and 1,669 trillion cubic feet of natural gas remain to be found north of the Arctic Circle. Another way to see it, up to a quarter of the world's undiscovered oil and gas might be buried in Arctic soils. In addition to hydrocarbons, the Arctic seafloor and exposed lands are believed to contain vast mineral deposits. Russia's Arctic alone may hold on the order of $2 trillion worth of minerals. These include nickel, copper, platinum, zinc, cobalt, and crucial rare earth elements. Fish stocks are also shifting. Fish currently worth about $560 million per year are caught in Arctic waters, and biologists project that value could increase manifold as warming waters draw commercially valuable species north. Naturally, investors and governments are eyeing the prize. The promise of Arctic resources has been called a new gold rush or energy treasure chest. Indeed, miners and energy farms are scouting drill sites and conducting geological surveys across the north. However, the Arctic's wealth is still largely theoretical and difficult to access. The extreme cold, remoteness, and ecological sensitivity make drilling and mining immensely challenging. Several expensive efforts have so far failed. For instance, the Royal Dutch Shelf abandoned major oil exploration of Alaska in 2015 after coming up dry. Cairn Energy likewise ceased Greenland drilling when results were disappointing. After 2014's oil price crash, many companies found Arctic extraction uneconomical at current prices. Nonetheless, rising global demand for natural gas and critical minerals keeps the incentive high. Russia, for example, is already pumping Arctic oil from East Siberian fields into the NSR pipeline. China is investing heavily in Arctic mineral prospecting and claims it will need Arctic energy to fuel its economy. Greenland is a key case study. The island has some of the richest seams of rare earth elements, lithium, niobium, and other critical metals crucial for batteries, electronics, and renewable energy technologies. Today, Greenland's government has drawn international attention by signing deals with US and Europe to develop mining projects that could supply Europe and North America. Investors from Denmark, Britain, and even Australia are advancing plans to mine Greenland's mountains for minerals like zinc, iron ore, and uranium. China too has expressed interest, though recent geopolitical rivalry has slowed Beijing's efforts. The race for Arctic resources is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it could supply the world with much-needed raw materials and energy. On the other hand, exploiting these resources threatens the very Arctic environment that made them so inaccessible in the first place. Environmental experts warn that drilling, mining, and tankers could worsen global warming through burning of newly produced fossil fuels and damage fragile ecosystems. In fact, commercial activity in the Arctic will simultaneously accelerate sea ice melt, ocean acidification, and rising temperatures, according to analysts. More infrastructure, roads, pipelines, and ports would fragment wilderness. In short, the prospect of Arctic resources is stirring both economic excitement and deep concern. Now let's meet the major players jockeying in the Arctic. Each has its own interest and style of playing the game. Russia, by far the most ambitious Arctic claimant, Russia has the Arctic's longest coastline via Siberia and has declared the region a national priority. It has reopened dozens of old Soviet Arctic bases since 2005, built the world's largest fleet of icebreakers, and is actively developing oil or gas projects in the Kara and Laptev seas. President Putin even set a target by 2030 move 100 million tons of cargo along the northern sea route. Militarily, Russia is often called the leader. It maintains nuclear subs, strategic bombers, hypersonic missiles, and other forces along its Arctic frontier. United States. The US is technically an Arctic nation because of Alaska and part of every Arctic treaty and forum. Historically, the Arctic wasn't a big focus for the US, but that's changing. The US has interests on both the Pacific side, which is Bering Sea, and Atlantic side, which is Greenland. Washington recently released new Arctic strategies emphasizing surveillance and partnerships. The US Coast Guard is refitting old polar icebreakers and planning new ones to operate in the Arctic. The Navy has reassessed patrols, even nuclear subs now sometimes transit under the ice near the North Pole, courtesy of recent thinner ice and better navigation tech. America is gearing up, but so far it hasn't built many new bases or forces. It's largely relying on alliances and partnerships, example NORAD with Canada. China, a wildcard. China is not an Arctic country by geography, yet it calls itself a near Arctic state and declared interest in the region. Over the last decade, Chinese companies have interest in Arctic projects. For instance, a stake in Russia's Yamal LNG terminal, and they lobby for access to Arctic shipping lanes. China's Belt and Road concept has even spawned a Polar Silk Road idea, envisioning Chinese ships on northern routes. A US Pentagon report bluntly warns that China and Russia are collaborating in the Arctic across multiple instruments of national power. China's agenda, it needs secure shipping alternatives, avoiding narrow choke points like the Malacca Strait, and it wants minerals, rare earth minerals, nickel, cobalt for its industries. Beijing also funded research icebreakers and has observer status in the Arctic Council. While China doesn't have ice-hardened warships or bases up north yet, their growing presence is a clear sign they are hedging bets. Canada. Canada's Arctic means a lot. It has the most islands and claims huge Arctic waters, the NWP. Ottawa is very keen on sovereignty. Canada invested in 2 new Arctic offshore patrol ships, ice-capable in the past few years. Canadian leaders often say the Arctic is a top priority. Canada even sued in international court to get its Arctic continental shelf recognized. A recent analysis notes Canada is working on partnerships, for example, buying icebreaker tech from Finland to bolster its presence. But there is a catch. Canada's military is not that huge, yet it has the world's second longest coastline. So Ottawa is trying beyond its capabilities with asymmetric strategies, sensors, and small patrol planes. A perennial issue, the Northwest Passage. Canada insists it's Canadian internal waters, but the US and EU says it's an international strait. In fact, US ships routinely transit unannounced from Alaska to Greenland via the passage, flanking Canada's claim. Norway has a long Arctic frontier, the Barents Sea, and a large oil and gas industry onshore and offshore in the north. Oslo is a Western ally, NATO members, and works closely with Russia. Example on fisheries, oil and gas exploration, etc. Norway also hosts vital infrastructure, a US-built early warning radar in Vardø, and the northernmost base of NATO in Tromsø. Norway tends to emphasize collaboration. It has never had a clash with Russia, unlike Canada or Russia over boundaries. Norway worries about security. Its defense chief warned of cable cuts and foreign subs under the ice, but its main approach is cautious, using alliance ties. Other players like Denmark via Greenland is watching closely. Greenland's newfound autonomy has stirred geopolitics. Remember, the US reportedly offered to buy Greenland, highlighting how strategic it is. The UK is also sniffing around. After all, British Royal Navy vessels have started to operate in Arctic patrols, and London recently passed the Arctic Agreement Act to enhance its role. The European Union is not an Arctic state, but it funds research and climate projects in the region. Even non-governmental actors like shipping firms and energy companies shape the scene through investments. To sum up, it's a global game of risk on ice. Russia and the US are the big predators. Canada and Norway care mainly about their own backyard. China is the upstart with deep pockets, and others are jockeying for regional influence. The stakes, both symbolic and material, are sky high or pole high. When we talk geopolitics, the obvious follow-up question is, are wars brewing in the Arctic? As the ice opens, many fear a repeat of Cold War tension. The reality, there is definitely military activity, but it's mixed with diplomacy. Russia's military buildup. As several sources note, the West trails Russia in military presence in the Arctic. Russia has reopened dozens of old bases built in the 1950s, stationed advanced missile systems in the far north, and put its Pacific and Northern fleets on high alert. It has nuclear-powered icebreakers, and last year, high-ranking analysts and Western countries would need a decade to catch up to Russia's Arctic forces if they really tried. Russia has also tested anti-ship missiles near the Arctic and staged large-scale exercises with dozens of ships and aircraft in the far north. NATO and allies. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization is stepping up. Norway, as a member, has raised its defense alert level in response to Arctic incidents. Germany's navy has sent minesweepers to the Arctic, and the UK and France have deployed frigates and patrol planes above the Arctic Circle. Even Arctic Council, which includes all these nations, tries to avoid overt military talk, but in parallel, nations engage in joint drills. For instance, recent Norway-led NATO exercises involved dozens of allied ships, planes and troops practicing cold weather ops. NATO's highest leaders have declared the Arctic a NATO North, where they will ensure security for all member states. US posture. The US Northern Command, NORTHCOM, and NATO's Allied Command have said they want to improve domain awareness, meaning radar satellite sensors to monitor Arctic space. The US has placed strategic ballistic missile subs on more patrols under the polar ice cap. The US Air Force and Marines have in recent years rotated through Alaska and Norway for cold weather training. The Coast Guard is planning a new heavy icebreaker, the future USCG Healy replacement, to assert presence. The Pentagon's 2024 Arctic strategy calls for more alliances and enhancements in the region. Example, multi-domain command centers, joint exercises with allies. US-Russia cooperation or competition. Officially, both sides claim a mix of cooperation on things like search and rescue, oil spill response, and vigilant rivalry. Putin has publicly said Russia is open to cooperation in the Arctic, but he also underscores the competition. Meanwhile, the US flew B-52 bombers near Alaska's coast, echoing Cold War style, and Canada periodically sends ships to monitor activity. China's military moves. China hasn't yet deployed an army in the Arctic, but it is watching closely. Chinese scientists and icebreakers are mapping sea lanes. There are reports of Chinese paramilitary icebreaker mapping parts of the Arctic deep sea floor. China also sent surveillance ships to joint exercises with Russia. In US defense thinking, China is interesting because it could theoretically use Arctic routes in a conflict, example as a backdoor supply line for Asia. But for now, Beijing publicly stresses win-win cooperation and sustainable development. Alliances and forums. The Arctic Council, with all 8 Arctic states plus indigenous permanent participants, is a unique forum that curiously excludes security or military issues. It's mostly about environment, science, and sustainable development. This is good for cooperation. Everyone has met regularly since 1996. But it means military tensions play out elsewhere, like NATO or the UN. For example, Canada and the US recently agreed on new defense cooperation in the Arctic, and the UK just announced its own Arctic Council membership. Russia and US even met under a 2011 search and rescue agreement in the Arctic, showing that some Cold War era cooperation can continue. Bottom line, yes, the Arctic is getting more militarized, but it's not exactly World War II material yet. Still, think of it as a Cold War zone building stage presence. Rhetorically, one might ask, will the Arctic become the next South China Sea with rivalry and standoffs? Or can it stay relatively peaceful? The answer is still unfolding, but the fact that Russia and China are doing joint drills, NATO is on alert, and the US just declared Arctic strategy shows it's a place everyone is watching. As we hurl into 2025, the Arctic is at a crossroads of climate, economics, and power. Let's end with some big picture, thought-provoking ideas. Will the Arctic fuel conflict or cooperation? On one hand, the scramble for oil, gas, minerals, and new shipping lanes could spark rivalry. Imagine if two countries both claim an under-ice oil field or a military incident occurs during a fishery patrol. Those could become flashpoints. We already see small sparks, tensions over Svalbard waters, disagreements on who controls the Northwest Passage, suspicion of Russian spy ships in Barents Sea fisheries. Yet, on the other hand, the Arctic is also a place of strong cooperation. The Arctic Council continues to foster joint research and safety protocols. The extreme environment often forces countries to share search and rescue duty. One question to ponder: can the Arctic become a model of post-Cold War cooperation, or will it become a source of new rivalry? Even if human conflict is managed, the environmental stakes are huge. Thawing permafrost could release more methane. More ships could mean more pollution and risk of oil spills in fragile ecosystems. Species like polar bears and seals may vanish faster if ice disappears. Indigenous people face rapidly changing landscapes. Every barrel of Arctic oil burned propels global warming, which melts more Arctic ice, which releases more carbon, a dangerous feedback loop. Some scientists warn we could see the first ice-free Arctic summer with a few decades, fundamentally altering weather patterns worldwide. Will the world handle this responsibly? Countries are weighing the reaches under the ice against the catastrophic costs of climate change. Should they drill and mine or protect the Arctic? A few governments and many activists argue for strict environmental protection, even a moratorium on drilling. Others, especially state-controlled enterprises, will push to extract wealth. For instance, some Greenlanders want to exploit rare earth minerals to fund their island's economy, while others worry about social impacts. The great question: can development be sustainable in the Arctic? New tech is coming. Better icebreakers, possibly even commercial nuclear-powered ships, might make year-round Arctic transit possible. Companies are developing autonomous polar drones and satellites for ice tracking. In a few years, we could see GPS navigation that accounts for polar day or night, or chatty cargo ships that upload real-time ice maps. All this means the Arctic could become much more integrated into the global economy. But who will set the rules? The geopolitics of the Arctic is a story in motion, one that will affect the whole world. As viewers of this video have seen, melting ice caps are literally opening new highways for commerce and conflict in the far north. Enormous deposits of oil, gas, and minerals lie within reach, enticing nations but also endangering a fragile environment and traditional ways of life. Countries like Russia, US, China, and Canada are staking claims and building military capabilities, even as indigenous people and scientists warn of irreversible harm. Whether this region becomes a blueprint for international cooperation or a hotbed of rivalry depends largely on the choices made today. The Arctic's future, one of collaboration or confrontation, remains unwritten. What is certain is that in a warmer world, the geostrategic importance of these polar waters will only grow. The lesson is clear: the Arctic will not stay frozen, so neither can our thinking about it. If this deep dive helped you chart the frozen frontier, smash that like button, subscribe for more geopolitical explainers, and share your thoughts below. How should the world govern the top of the planet?